Okay, hello, welcome, all that. Um, yeah, weird times that we're living in. So, quick updates before we dive into this. Like I said, this was not going to be a super long lecture right now. I have the rhetors lecture for next class session already done, so that should be being put into Blackboard immediately after I finish this one, and those will be in the section called class lectures. I put that in a folder. I put all your annotation articles that are left in another folder. I just tried to clean up that content area quite a bit more to make things a lot easier. I'm aiming to only try and send you one email a day, just to give you reminders and things like that, because stuff's going to get hard and it's going to get overwhelming for you. And I don't want to be the one that overwhelms you. I want to try and make it as gentle and easy as possible. I'm also putting in some instructions for the group project, which I recorded last year, luckily, because I had some job interviews last year. And so I had a couple of lecture recordings already done. And so the instructions for the literature review that we'll be doing later will be placed into the lecture section as well. So that'll be good. I'm playing catch up on a lot of things. Like, I know that some of the grading things are not put into Blackboard yet. Like, please bear with me. I'm working on it. I'm trying to get there. Everything is everything's crazy. We live in crazy times. So since we're going to talk about, since I'm talking about crazy times, let's get into terrorists, right? Because they're also a little bit wackadoodle too. However, Rowland and Theye do a really good job of trying to explain why they're a little bit wackadoo, why they're a little bit crazy, a little bit why they do the things that they do. I thought that this article was interesting and worthwhile because it goes back to what we were talking about myth and narratives and things like that from the last chapter. Rowland, if you want to know anything more about him, I'm sure in your annotations you have things about Rowland and Theye. But fun facts about Rowland is since he's at Kansas, Jay Self knew him pretty well, and he's a spitfire, right? He's a very small, unassuming old guy, and very, very set in his ways and things, and the type of person who will start arguments with other dissertation committee members while you're doing your defense, and you're just kind of sitting in between of all of it, and it's kind of weird. Other fun fact about him is I gave him a ride from Slow's Barbecue in Detroit after my advisor's car got broken into and his laptop got stolen. So anyhow, let's get into this a little bit. All right. Big opening claim that they have here, right? The very first line, right, is terrorism is by its very nature a rhetorical act, right? That's a big deal. He's saying that terrorism isn't just someone who's trying to kill people. It's a rhetorical act. It's something where they're trying to send a message. It's not that it's and they're trying to send a message that's based in a persuasive style of message. It's not just anger or hate. It's a response, and a response to what they imply is some type of a situation. So that means that if terrorism is a rhetorical act, then it's important to respond as a rhetorical act. And so that's a huge opening claim that they have right in the beginning. So if it's a rhetorical act, yeah, then rhetoric is what's needed to defeat it, right? No amount of bombs that we drop on people is going to be able to defeat the underlying rhetorical aspects of terrorism, according to this article, right? But what he's interested in unpacking, or I'm sorry, what he and she, right, because Theye is also involved here, what they're interested in unpacking is the so people do terrorist things, and that's really weird. That's a strange behavior, right? So what kind of persuasive appeal, what kind of rhetorical appeal would convince someone to actually lay down their life for something, to actually sacrifice themselves in order for a greater cause? And he they try and unpack that, but also like at the end of the article, they're kind of saying it like more important than the military campaign is winning the hearts and minds, or like winning this rhetorical battle with terrorists if we want to actually solve this problem. Much like when Kenneth Burke, which Burke comes up in here, of course, because like when doesn't Burke come up? Much like where he's trying to figure out like how to do things like stop people like Hitler from coming to power again. Rowland and Theye are taking this like high-minded ideal of like, what do we do about things like terrorism, because like we can't afford to like have these endless wars and things like that. So they're trying to like unpack this whole thing and figure it all out. Other big claim: all ideological and religious terrorist groups share the same symbolic system, right? Religious groups, like he says, like all the religious groups that engage in terrorism share the same type of symbolic system. Now, he's not saying that like every single religious group has a symbolic system, right? No, they're saying that like the ones who engage in like this extremist forms of terrorism share the same symbolic system. But they also like has this ideological / religious, right? So there's a lot of questions in here as to like, well, do ideological groups apply this same sort of like DNA equally, or does it apply the same way? For the most part, they argue not quite as much, that religion is a little bit more potent. But is it possible for ideological groups? They don't shut that door. They definitely would say like it's certainly a possibility. All right. So they do mention like what they aim to do on page 54. In this essay, we argue that the symbolic DNA of a terrorist message is a mythic symbolic pattern that serves as both a persuasive and epistemic device. We'll get into that in a second here. The most dangerous terrorist groups, including those carrying out mass casualty attacks against civilian targets, rely on a mythic rhetorical pattern based in religion or an ideological mythic system similar to religion, right? So like myth is front and center in here, which is what we talked about a lot in the narrative chapter, right? Like why are myths important? How do they help us to construct our identity? How does it help us to like understand who we are? And so this is like really pulls a lot of that research of like the idea of like what myths are and like how powerful they can be, because the power of a myth can be powerful enough to like cause people to like do really horrific acts. So terrorist messages are myths. They serve as both a persuasive and epistemic device. Now, epistemic, what does this mean? What is epistemology? Epistemology, like we've probably mentioned this in class before, it is the research and the study of how we create knowledge, how we come to know things, okay? So it's in contrast to ontology. Like ontology says that like the situation that you're in would define a reaction. And epistemic drama means that the symbol system has literally redefined the world, and reality itself is reshaped to fit that knowledge system, right? So like for terrorism, these authors argue that like ontology doesn't explain why people blow themselves up and do like horrible things like 9/11 and things like that, right? They're saying that like the situation that they're in, like it doesn't make sense for that reaction to happen, right? But the epistemic genre says that like if you are embedded in a knowledge system, right, in a symbol system that says that like there is this DNA that's going on, right, and this myth that is like under this myth that is built on a foundation of the DNA that they're talking about, like that like will change someone into like an identity that where like the logic of doing something like a terrorist act makes sense. In fact, it's like a mandate. It is like a heroic act. That like changes like how they come to know who they are. It changes people who come to know who we are through that myth. Um, so we can see that these myths and systems are very, very powerful in nature, right? I'm going to flip to page 58 as well, because like I've got a quote here and I do not quite remember why I thought it was important. Um, so bear with me. Like, here we go with online learning. Yeah, mythic ideological systems are especially powerful because they serve as totalistic devices for explaining the world, providing a sense of identity and putting the individual in touch with the transcendent, right? That's the top of page 58. Like, they're powerful because it's a totality, right? It explains everything that's happening in the world. It is like a unifying narrative that says like, oh, like this is happening, right? This bad thing is happening or this good thing is happening because it fits into my entire belief system and sense of identity, and it puts me in touch with like the transcendent. It puts me in touch with like this justification that is beyond something beyond my own individual like life experience, right? They do say that not all myths are religious, but they are like have this sense of the sacred. They have this sense of like yeah, like this myth that I may like be like adhering to might not be rooted in a religion, but it still is like something that is a formational like helps to form my identity, and it also like it tells a story that like explains an ultimate truth, a capital T truth, right? We've talked about before how like people who think they have capital T truths often do really bad things. This would be an example. Um, Okay. Um, Ideologies and myths are often combined in a mythic ideological system in which ideology describes the society and our role within it, and the myth provides the transcendent justification for both, right? So the myth is not the ideology, right? The myth is the justification for the ideology that is trying to be like enforced. So like uh they use this Al Qaeda example. There's lots of different examples that we can do for this. Like the ideology of like white nationalism, like kind of like fits into this a lot. Like white nationalism would be like an ideology that like would lead to violent acts, right? But the myth would be something about like past greatness of the white race or like ideas of crusades, right? We often see like people who are involved in white nationalist groups like thinking about things like the Knights Templar or like religious like crusades, even though like a lot of these like white nationalist like groups are not really founded in a religious calling. It's more of like a racial type of calling instead, or they might be attacking people, or like a lot of those groups like the New Zealand shooter, for example, right? He wasn't really religiously motivated, but he felt like this idea that like his identity was being threatened, and so he took out the people that he viewed as a threat to that identity. We'll see like how that might fit into this DNA idea as well. Um, so the DNA is right here. Like this is what they're talking about, right? They're not talking about like the DNA like as some type of like biological thing, right? He says like the DNA of terrorism is like a mythic symbolic system that has these three elements. First is denial, right? That like your identity is being threatened with annihilation by some group or something like that, by someone else. Negation means that like the people who are the other, who are apart from you, they do not exist as people, right? Their identity does not exist, right? That they are just like less than people. That is a key element too, right? You have to like negate the enemy in order to like believe that they're not only out to get you, but like they are it's okay to kill them, right? And then lastly is affirmation, where like the new identity through this myth that constructs for the terrorist constructs for themselves, like creates them as a hero bringing a future that is going to be like perfection, that is going to be utopian, right? And like it's not murder then. The quote that they have is like the terrorist acts, this is on page 60, terrorist acts that kill members of that other group, are not murder but sacramental violence to cleanse the world of evil, right? If you think of people like bugs, then you view like the killing of bugs as possibly a cleansing of your apartment. So if you view people as bugs, then you might view killing them as like cleansing evil from the world, right? Um, so through the remainder of the article, they talk about how yes, there are other types of groups that could like have this secular message that engage in terrorism, and they talk about the Weather Other Underground as a an example, uh, and then makes the claim that like religious terrorism a bit more dangerous and that they're more likely to use weapons of mass destruction. Now, this is interesting because like one of the things is like when you're reading these articles, it is absolutely okay to be critical, right? I'm not sure about like their claim here that like a religious group makes them especially more dangerous and more likely to use weapons of mass destruction. I'm not sure if that's the case. Perhaps, perhaps not. Like, but it's important to like at least like have that critical idea of being like, all right, well, I'm not sure how well backed this claim is. Maybe I should look at like the Hudson 1999 article that they're referencing, or the Richardson 2006 article about the growth in like such types of groups and things like that, because it seems a little like lightly researched there. But at any rate, they do like progress in like saying like, look, there's the the sense of doing God's will as a transcendent goal through violence, like that's more powerful than most secular types of causes. And like I can I can understand their argument, but like it's interesting to like always like think about that more. Even though like I mean like just right after that they talk about the Tamil Tigers, which is not a religious group really, and they have engaged in terrorist acts in India as well. So uh, it's an interesting argument that they kind of go back and forth on, right? So with this idea of religious things being used as a way to justify and look at violence. They do talk about Al Qaeda a lot more than any other type of religion. This is just the example that they used. All right, you could certainly apply it to many other religious groups that engage in this. I want to like make sure that like we know that like they're talking about Al Qaeda because at the time that this was written, this was a very big concern. But on top of that, that like it certainly could be used on lots of different religions. And the idea of like finding like scriptures and things like that from the Quran as like a way to justify this type of violence like could certainly be found in like a Christian Bible as well. If you remember Pulp Fiction, if you ever saw the movie Pulp Fiction, I'm not going to play the scene for you because it's super violent. But if you want to, you can find it on YouTube where Samuel L. Jackson reads a quote from Ezekiel talking about like, you will know my name is the Lord when I strike down and exert great, or when I strike down in great vengeance and things like that. Right. So like you can find these things like these extremist types of quotes in lots of different ways. So yeah, So white nationalist attacks on Muslim communities can certainly fit into this as well, right? They are denied, white nationalists often feel that like the identity of like being white is under threat. Um, One of the ways that it's under threat is through something that they call white genocide, which is not about like literally killing white people. It's about race mixing. And so like they feel that like their identity themselves is being denied. And so negation happens when you look at people of other races as like non-beings, and like affirmation happens when like the New Zealand shooter is like loud, like considered a hero among these white nationalist groups, and like that can be a very, very problematic recipe. So like, I just want to like definitely reiterate that like this idea of it just being Al Qaeda. This is just the example that they used in this article. Is not meant to single out Muslims at all. In fact, he argues at the end to say that like we have to like show like the Islamic community that like we're not trying to fight the Islam as a religion, and that we're not trying to do that as a way to combat extremist terrorists. Um, yeah. This was like this is kind of interesting. Like I included this because it was the original ending to Rambo, if you ever heard of that film. It's an older film with Sylvester Stallone, probably way before you were born. But yeah, this was the original ending, and the Mujahideen fighters were actually led by Osama bin Laden against. They were fighting against Russia at the time that this movie came out, and then 9/11 happens, and we end up fighting the same people. But like it's interesting because like this idea of like having that on there is kind of like their recipe to solve this problem of terrorism, right? Because at the end of this article, after like they talk about like the myth of return, right, and how that identity and purpose in life like is important to like cause people to do these heinous acts, right? That's the affirmation section. I want to like skip ahead to the conclusion. I'm flipping through this thing by myself right now too. Um, yeah, like the most important thing is to bust the myth, right? To rhetorically strike down the myth. And one of the ways to do that, he says, or they say, is to avoid ridiculing the enemy, right? Or like the terrorists themselves, right? Because like if that ridicule is perceived from outside of that group, then it's feeding into this idea of denial that you are out to get these people, and like that their identity, that you're a threat to their identity. Ridicule from within the group is okay, right? Because that calls into question the power of those people who are perpetuating the myth. But if it comes from the outside, that's going to create more adherence to like the denial aspect of DNA. The second thing that they say is important is creating a counter narrative that undercuts the threat to identity, right? When George W. Bush was talking about it, was talking about like things with Al Qaeda, he tried to make it a very big point to say that like we're not conducting a war against Islam, that we're conducting a war against extremism, right? And like when we link extremism with Islam, then like that again creates the idea that like, oh, they're out to get like this religion, which I might be a member of, and that might influence me to be radicalized, right? That like I might think that like that you are a threat to my identity. One of the ways that they said could help to undercut this idea would be to do things like all of the aid that we sent to Indonesia and other Islamic nations for tsunami relief, that when there was a huge tsunami that like really like devastated that region of the world, that like we sent a lot of aid. So like doing things for Islamic nations undercuts the idea that we would be a threat to their identity, and that would be that type of humanitarianism is a way to actually like fight the war rhetorically, in a sense. And lastly, they say that like the idea of the return story needs to be confronted, right? That confronting the Al Qaeda myth of return is critical. You can't refute a myth by saying like no, but you can like undercut it by promoting other people of the same group that have different views, right? So like to translate it to like Christianity, like you could be like, yeah, like this idea of Christianity, one idea of Christianity or one denomination might be rather extremist, right? While like maybe a Protestant is less extremist, or like an Episcopalian has their own moderate views and things like that. And so all of these things can like undercut this idea of like a return story that is like irrefutable. And so their suggestion is to say that like there's lots of different scholars of Islam that have differing views of like how Islam like interacts with other things and how Islam is to be interpreted. And so that idea is the important for like combating like this myth, right? Because like if terrorism is rooted in the power of a myth, the only way to beat it is to either a kill every single person who would be adhering to that myth, and to do it all at once, right? Because like otherwise you would just be creating more people who would believe in the myth, right? And that's just probably a bad idea. The second way though is to like undercut the myth itself, to like have counter stories, have like counter narratives that say like, hey, like this myth says that like that these people are out to get me and like against my identity, but like they just also like assisted my community, so that doesn't square up, right? Or this myth like says that like these people are negated, that they don't exist, they're all agents of the oppressor, but like I just met one and like they seemed all right, they seemed like a good person, so that undercuts the idea of the symbolic DNA of terrorism too. So all of these ways that like if terrorists are like telling these stories possessing a similar symbolic DNA, then the only way to get rid of it is to like undercut that story, right? To have evidence of like a counter story in order to do that. So this article is decent because like what, or at least like in my opinion, I think it's pretty good because it really like says like how myth derives its power for a specific group. It uses myth as a way to analyze the rhetoric of terrorism, right? And so that's why this is a good like rhetorical analysis. It explains more about the actions of people due to myth, like under a lens of myth, but it also explains more about how myth itself operates and how we learn more about how myth and ideology interact with each other as a methodological sense. And like that's why this article like is like very valuable, is like it's not just talking about the terrorists themselves, it's talking about a broader methodology of like how we come to understand how myth creates identity and how myth justifies ideological things. And that is like that's the main takeaway that I get from this article. And if you have different ideas and want to talk about them, start yourself a discussion group. That's cool. Or like want to bounce ideas off of me. That's awesome too. Last thing, I guess I'm gonna put this in the email to for today, but like my office hours will remain the same. So if you are contacting me during my office hours, I will contact you back like right away. There's no guarantees outside of my office hours, but I've been pretty good about that too. So hopefully that was good for like this first online lecture. We'll see what happens. And the Redder one will also be posted very, very soon. And I will be putting a quiz on for the Redder one. I haven't wrote it yet because it's going to be a little bit harder, but I'll have all the instructions for that in tomorrow's email, not today's. All right. Thank you. Bye.